Okay, we are going to talk now about 12-3, which is solve word problems using measurement data. So you'll see I have another line plot here. This one is on Amazon rainfall, and it says it's in inches. So it's like the Amazon rainfall for a month. Okay? And you'll notice that with this line plot, there are some numbers on the number line that are marked and labeled, and that there are some that are not. And in this case, you should be able to figure out the numbers that are not labeled. And the way you do that is you take the number, like between the number 0 and 1, and you count the number of spaces in between. So there's 1 space in between 0 and 1, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 4 spaces. Oops, sorry, I erased that just a little bit. So as you can see, this is going up by fourths. So this unlabeled spot is 1/4. We know that 1/2 is the same as 2/4. So that's why they put 1/2 here. And then this is 3/4, and then 4/4 is 1. So what would this be right here then, if this is going up by fourths? Well, what's between 1 and 1/2? It'd be 1 and 1/4. So it's 0, 1/4, 2/4 or 1/2, 3/4, 1, 1 and 1/4, 1 and 1/2, and then what's between 1 and 1/2 and 2? Well, if you're going up by fourths, remember 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. So this is 1 and 3/4. That's another way of representing the data, and the reason they take out those spots is because it looks a little cluttered when you have all of them in there, and you should be able to figure out by counting the spaces in between two numbers, like counting the spaces in between 0 and 1. There was 4 spaces in between 0 and 1, so this is going up by fourths. Okay? And so let's talk about this. Well, we have data here, and we're going to find the difference. That word difference means subtraction, between the greatest amount of rainfall in a day and the least amount of rainfall in a day. Well, the greatest that any particular day had was 2 inches. That was the greatest number on our line plot. There were 1, 2, 3, 4 days that had 2 inches. But we're not going to count each day. The greatest that any particular day had was 2 inches. Now, what was the least amount of rainfall any day had? It was 3/4 of an inch. So we're going to find the difference between those two numbers. Now, when you see this, you'll see one of those subtraction problems where we're going to need to borrow. Because you'll notice that it's just 2 and nothing is over here when I'm borrowing, or when I'm subtracting. So I'm going to take 2 and I'm going to make it a 1. But remember, when you make this a 1, you bring the 1 over here, and 1 is the same as 4/4. Okay? So 4/4 minus 3/4 is 1/4, and 1 minus 0 is 1. So the difference between the greatest amount, which was 2, and the least amount, which is 3/4, is 1 and 3/4 inches. We call that our range, the difference between the greatest and the least amounts. That's the range of your data. Okay? Questions so far on this, make sure you're emailing me about it, but I'm going to flip it to the back so we can just look at another example, okay? This example says the amount of salt left, and it's in grams. Once again, we have a line plot, and once again, we have numbers that aren't labeled on our line plot, but we should be able to figure them out. We take 1 and 2, and how many spaces are in between 1 and 2? There's 1 space in between it. 2 spaces. So this is going up by halves. Okay, so this would be 1 and 1/2. What's between 2 and 3? 2.5. What's between 3 and 4? 3.5. What's between 4 and 5? 4.5. What's between 5 and 6? 5.5. And what's between 6 and 7? 6.5. So that's just another way of knowing those unlabeled spots on the line plot. Okay? The question here is we're going to find the total amount of salt that is left. So we're going to count all of these dots individually. Remember that each one of these dots represents 1 1/2. Each one of these dots represents 4. Each one of these dots represents 6 1/2, and each one of these dots represents 7. Well, the 4 and the 7 are whole numbers, so they're easier to figure out. 4, and I have 2 dots. Well, what's 4 times 2? This is 8. Remember, we're finding the total all together. 7, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dots. That's 35. Now let's talk about 1 1/2. I know that 1 1/2 plus 1 1/2 equals 3. So every 2 dots is 3. So that's 3. That's 6. That's 9. Okay? And then if I add 1 1/2 to 9, I get 10 1/2. Okay? So this area represented 10 1/2 grams. Now let's talk about 6 1/2. Well, I know that 6 1/2 plus 6 1/2 equals, well, what's 12 plus 1? It's 13. So these two are 13, and then I have to add 6 1/2 to that. Well, 6 1/2 plus 13 equals, 13 plus 6 1/2 equals 19 1/2. So I have each section labeled. Now I need to put them all together, add them all together to find the total amount of salt left. Well, let's do that. We're going to add 10 1/2 plus 8 plus 19 1/2 plus 35. Remember, when we add fractions, we keep that over there separated from the other side. So what's 1/2 plus 1/2? It's 1. Well, 10 plus 8 equals 18. Okay? 18 plus 19 equals 37. And then 37 plus 35 equals 72. So on this side I have 72, and on this side I have 1. Well, what would be the total amount of grams left? 73 grams. Okay? If you have any questions on that or any concerns, make sure that you're emailing me. You can also call me. Remember that I have my number on the Google document. And I will see you next time. Bye.